Hi everybody, I'm Jim Stavridis, the Dean here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I want to begin by welcoming everybody to an event that has really occupied a lot of my thinking and my attention as I made the transition 3 years ago from a long career, some would say my misspent youth in the Navy, to becoming an academic, to becoming the Dean here at the Fletcher School. And the topic is this idea of a gap or a kind of a parting of the ways between academic world, which I now occupy, and the policy world, which I spent the majority of my career in the middle of. What I would tell you as I welcome you here to the Fletcher School for this really extraordinary star-studded cast of characters you're going to hear from is that I do think there is a gap between the academic and the policy world. And I think we are poorer as a nation and as a society for that. Why? Because, let's face it, the academic world is full of brilliant people who are every day wake up in the morning and think about how can I possibly contribute more to the ideas of the world. And on the policy side, having spent over 3 decades there, I can tell you people wake up every day in the morning thinking, boy, I need a new idea. I've got to have a plan B. As I'm recording this in preparation for the conference, we see yet another ceasefire absolutely crater in Syria. And I feel policymakers in Washington and in Moscow scrambling for what's plan B. Here in the academic world, we have many brilliant thinkers. Now that is an example chosen from security studies, but we could equally find examples of policy makers in need of new ideas, of data, of research, of facts in every dimension, certainly of international relations, and of course in every other discipline. So why does this gap exist? Well, I'll give you a couple of theories, having spent 3 years looking at it. One is, here in the academy, there is a tendency to increase specialization constantly. And our faculties, because they always want to take on new and dynamic challenges, are so often narrowing the breadth of their research. So I think I'm not going to be an advocate for broadening necessarily, but in terms of applicability to policy, often that extremely narrow view is very difficult to translate. So I think specialization on one side of the equation here in the academic world might be part of the challenge. And I'd encourage you to debate that and think about that. Secondly, over on the policy maker side of things, I think there is a tendency to be moving too quickly and an unwillingness to stop and really absorb research and data and think through the problems. Now, part of that is understandable because of the speed at which the world moves, but part of it has simply become part of the culture, the gunslinger culture of policy, which is pull your gun out and start moving. Those two cultures are very difficult to bridge. And of course, that's what you'll be thinking about and talking about over the next couple of days. I'm often asked, well, you know, Admiral, you got a PhD along the way. You've published 6 books and a couple of 100 articles, almost none of them, by the way, in refereed journals, but lots of articles in respectable publications, as well as many, many, many op-eds. And so I'm often asked, well, you were in the military, you were a policymaker, but you also nudged into the academic world. So as a policymaker, say when I was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, I'm asked, did you tap into the academic world? And the answer is yes, I did. And I found willing partners. I'll give you 2 examples. In 2009, as I became the NATO commander, I wanted to understand more deeply Vladimir Putin. As we have seen, he's been on a shall we say, a negative trajectory in terms of his relationships with the United States, with NATO, over the last 4 years. So this was back in 2009. And I had a lot of CIA data and a lot of intelligence, of course, from the Department of Defense. But I reached out into the academic world to a group of scholars. I can't list all their names, but one really stands out. Her name is Angela Stent, and she's a professor at Georgetown, at one of our competitor schools. And she is a brilliant scholar of Russia and specifically of Putin. The work she did to help me understand the psychology of Vladimir Putin absolutely influenced the way that I contributed to the policy debates in Washington. By the way, Dr. Stent has recently published a book, some of which came out of her work and her conversations as part of my European advisory group. A second example I would give you of trying to use policymakers was actually from my time before NATO, when I was the kind of the equivalent job for Latin America and the Caribbean. The job is called Commander of U.S. Southern Command. And here, I wanted to understand what people thought about the U.S. military in Latin America and the Caribbean. We often debate and think about what do residents of those beautiful countries think about the United States, but I needed data and information about how is the U.S. military received, because I wanted to shape a campaign of military to military exchanges in the way that would be most effective. Well, what I got back was no surprise to those who really study issues in Latin America. The U.S. military is deeply unpopular throughout much of this region. Why? Because the United States has repeatedly invaded countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly in Central America and the Caribbean, as well as Mexico, of course. So there's an overriding sense of negativity about the U.S. military. So we dug deeper into the research, and here I was accessing the University of Miami and the very excellent Policy Center on Latin America there. And they were able, through using both polling information, some of which they did original work for us, as well as analysis of previous academic research, they were able to help us craft a campaign of military to military engagement that reduced the hard edge appearance of the U.S. military and invested more in physical fitness, leadership, human rights. We did baseball clinics, for example. We sent hospital ships. We reshaped our campaign based on academic research, based on crossing this divide that we've spoken of. So I hope you'll think about that, and you'll continue to think about how the bridge can be built. And I'll give you a very important aspect of it, and that is when academics are willing to go into government and do policy work. Here at the Fletcher School, most recently, we had Professor Kelly Sims Gallagher and Professor Michael Klein, who I think will be speaking with you later, as two examples of individuals who went in, one into the Treasury, another on the NSC staff, to help negotiate, to bring their knowledge, their wisdom accumulated through years in the academic world into government. That kind of personal contact can trump everything. And how we can do more of that, I think, would be an interesting set of conversations for this group to be having. And then my other suggestion is that all of our colleagues in this academic world, as they think about how to move their ideas into the policy world, need to realize that policymakers are moving very, very fast. They're not always going to have time to sit down and read a lengthy article. They're not going to have enormous amounts of time to read detailed books. But they do have time to read medium-length articles, probably not in refereed journals, but in policy journals, foreign policy, foreign affairs, U.S. Naval Institute proceedings in the maritime world, Signal magazine in the communications world. Those kind of medium-length, non-refereed, non-academic articles often have enormous impact, and they get passed around in the policy world. And then secondly, that op-ed. I can't tell you the number of times that I have written an op-ed since I've left government and been called by someone in the White House, someone at State Department, someone at DOD, asking me, well, what did you mean by this? And how would we do this? And an example, a concrete one most recently, was a piece I did on partitioning Syria, which I think increasingly is going to be part of the solution there. Big debate, but a short piece of 1,000 words can often spark the policy debate in Washington. That's another way to close that gap. So my fundamental task today is to welcome all of you to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I do want to say I'm particularly excited about using the TEDx format here at the Fletcher Ideas Exchange. It's a way that we can kind of have espresso shots of knowledge that we exchange. And I think you're going to truly enjoy that. I did a TED Talk myself some years ago. It continues to bounce around. When you do these talks, they end up kind of spreading like ripples in a pond. So enjoy the format as well. Welcome to the Fletcher School, and thank you for grappling with this crucial idea.